For those of you that were on the call last week, this week is going to be a little bit more informal. Aaron and I are going to have more of a conversation about his career and his experiences in professional sport and his subsequent careers. So I think, Aaron, if we may want to start off by you telling us a little bit about how you got involved in cycling in the first place and how did your journey start?
Yeah, so cycling for me, there was, when I started out, obviously when I started out in sport, it was GAA soccer, actually, interestingly enough, at the start. That's where it all began. And I was average enough at soccer and team sports, although I trained quite hard. It just didn't seem to suit me. And I had an uncle that he was an uncle-in-law married into my family who was a professional cyclist at the time. And I looked up to him straight away. He was prolific on the Irish scene at that stage. He won almost every race that I would have went to see as a youngster. I was about 13, 14 at this stage. And that's where the kind of interest started. I watched him for a year before I actually got the urge to start competing myself. And then I started there. My first race was probably around 14, 15. And I got dropped, like literally when the flag dropped, everyone else was gone and I was left trying to clip in on the start line. That's where it started, funnily enough. But it started from there, and while I was nowhere near, I didn't show any God-given talents when I started out in the sport. The sport suited me. It suited my personality in terms of, you go away, you prepare, and you prepare meticulously, and you come back and you compete on your own merit. And I like that element of it. And that's where it all started for me, really. So.
And what were the kind of steps that you took throughout your career then? If you started as an amateur, what was the next stage for you?
So, yeah, I started out as an amateur when I was about 16, 17. I started, making provincial teams and getting picked for occasional national teams at that stage. And, it still wasn't very good at that stage, even though I was making some teams. I figured that 18, I made my first kind of 17, 18 European Championships type level. But, once I stepped up to that level, I was getting a real beating. Like, I was able to do well in Ireland at that stage. But once you step up to the international stage, I took a right beating. But, it took a right few years at that level to start, showing your face and actually picking up some results. And once you move through the amateur ranks, the way it kind of works in Ireland is once you get good enough and you're able to win in Ireland, you have to leave. It's quite similar to soccer, really. You have to go to a club abroad. You have to leave quite young. But Paul, who I didn't introduce there, he was my uncle, mentor-like character at that stage. He didn't want me going abroad. Thought I was too young. Wanted me to finish school. I wanted my efforts to be spread across other areas before I dove in, and while he was there, I definitely wouldn't have been going abroad. So I knew that the path would have led to going to Europe, trying to compete in France or Belgium or somewhere like that as an amateur, which the level is so much higher than in Ireland, way higher. And you spend a few years there, kind of like an apprenticeship. You learn your trade, and you hopefully get picked up by a pro team if you're good enough from there. So that's pretty much it. And then you compete with you get picked for national teams at that level as well. If you're figuring well at an amateur level in those countries, you're deemed as good enough to make national teams as well.
And what did 16 or 17-year-old you feel about your mentor's views of you pairing your education with your career?
It was difficult at that time. I wouldn't say academically I was fine. I didn't mind that side of school. I liked some elements of it, but the environment I really didn't like. I hated it, to be honest. I didn't really want to be there ever. Funnily enough, the road that he left training every day was on my school road, so that would often clash with me seeing him going out on the bike while I was going into school, which really didn't help. He should have left it for 15 minutes after I got in the gate. So yeah, that was difficult. I didn't know why he wanted me to stay at that, because at that age you think you're going to be the next Lance Armstrong. You think you're going to take over the cycling world. And he knew the reality of the sport that I was going into, and making a career would have been very, very difficult. So he wanted me to branch out.
Was there anybody at that point in time telling you were going to be the next Lance Armstrong?
Absolutely nobody. Absolutely nobody. And I think I remember overhearing my parents having a discussion at one stage when I'd say I was 17 and 17 or 18. I remember standing in the hallway and I overheard them saying, he honestly thinks he's going to be the next Lance Armstrong. He's got to wake up. And at that age, you're sitting there going, I'll fucking show them, I will be the next Lance Armstrong. Little did I know how difficult the next 5-10 years were going to be, but it just shows you where your head's at when you're a youngster. You think, you're going to take on the whole world.
So where were you at in that point of time when you made the decision to make a go at the professional scene? Obviously, the relationship with your mentor wasn't there anymore.
Yeah, so I was 17 when I started making the senior national team. At that stage, Sport Ireland started funding the track side of cycling quite heavily. And I'm quite big, so I suited track cycling. In comparison to climbing up hills and stuff, you kind of have to be below the kind of 50-60 kilo mark if you're looking to do that, and I'm a chunk heavier than that. So I started doing some track stuff, and that was largely based abroad because we don't have a velodrome in Ireland. It was based in Switzerland at the time. My uncle would have figured heavily on that team, so I trained with him and went to a couple of those training camps, and they were real highlights for me, because little did I know, when I was 18, he was killed in a car accident when I was 18. I just turned 18, and that was someone that I trained with every day, someone that was more than just a mentor, was a best mate and everything else included in that. So we would have done everything together. So initially when that happened, obviously it was the biggest tragedy, and still probably the biggest tragedy that I've ever gone through personally. But within a couple of months after that, and this is kind of a theme through all the setbacks, it kind of propelled me into a completely different mindset afterwards. I trained harder. I looked after myself better. I didn't think that was even possible until that process started, but it was. I trained twice as much, recovered better, and really looked for every kind of adaptation I could make, whether that be nutrition and everything. So I went all in, and that wasn't conducive to staying in school, unfortunately. So I left in leaving cert year to go to an academy in France, with very reluctant parental consent. I wasn't even going to tell them I was going. I was just going to say, listen, I'm going on a training camp and then not come back for a year. But I didn't.
How do you think that might have worked out?
It definitely wouldn't have worked out well. I during that process, even funnier, my dad is he's in the building game, and he's like, you leave school, you're not a professional yet, you're not being paid, you're going to have to earn some money. So you're going to come to work with me. And I was thinking, how the fuck am I going to train at that level while working on a building site with him? But I was forced to do it for a couple of months, and I trained even harder when I had the time. Won a couple of races, and he kind of gave me, it whittled from a 5-day week down to a 3-day week, and then I was working the occasional day, and then that was it. I was gone, and I left for France. And leaving for France at 17, just turning 18, it was, I can remember standing on a conveyor and my parents looking at me going across it, and I was putting on a brave face, parents breaking down, wondering where the hell I was going for the next year. And I put on a brave face for about half an hour until I realized, fucking hell, this is real. I'm actually going to France on my own, and I had no idea what I was getting myself in for. I lived in an apartment on my own for the first year. Couldn't speak French. Obviously, all my teammates were French, and for me, I kind of, in some ways, I saw it as a failure coming back. I didn't have my leaving cert. Obviously, I left, and I felt a little bit at some stages when I got down, I felt a little bit like I trapped myself in that situation. But like everybody, I kind of put it away and worked hard, and luckily I stayed there for the year. It was very difficult though.
Tell us a little bit about what training in that environment is like. So you're on your own. Did you know how to cook or clean?
I learned pretty quickly. You had to. I was very, very lucky. I had an Australian teammate came to the team halfway through that season. He was 28 and I was 18. So he'd raced internationally at a high level for years, and he was kind of making a bit of a comeback. And he saw himself as a bit of a chef and everything else. So that was great. And I learned a lot off him and a lot of the other people I lived with. I was very lucky with the people that kind of landed in my circle while I was there. There was an Irish guy there, an older guy as well, that happened to manage the team's books, who was very good to me while he was there. But aside from that, I had to kind of dig in, learn the language. You're sitting on the team bus, everyone's laughing, you can't really join in with it. It gets a bit difficult. You're like, I got to pick up the language pretty quick here. I feel like everyone's slagging you off.
How's your French now?
Probably where it started when I landed in France. it'd come back quick enough if I had to. I could speak it, I'd say, in a matter of weeks, but writing it was never my forte, to be honest.
And what were training days like? How often were you training, and for how many hours, and what sort of mileage?
Yeah, so it's kind of a free for all at that level. You kind of come in with your own coaches. It's not like when you get to the pro ranks, you're kind of giving your coach and people watch what you're doing essentially. But because I had all the time in the world to train, and that was all I had to do every day, you're probably averaging in and around 500-600 kilometers a week, 5-6 hours training in a day, whether that be double sessions or speed sessions in the morning, gym sessions in the evening, that kind of stuff. But you're talking on an average, I'd say it's 20-25 hours training a week.
Okay, so 17, 18, sorry, yeah, you said just turned 18 going over there.
Yeah.
What was the decision process behind coming home again?
There was no coming home at the end of that first season. I had a crash at the very end of the season, and I didn't realize I'd hit my knee quite badly, and that was the first major setback that I had. So I had the next 9 months trying to figure out, with no money, no income. I wasn't getting paid at this stage. Their idea of wages in France at that level is they drop a box of fruit and veg at your front door on a Friday evening, and that's it. Like, you don't hear from them again until you're getting picked up for a race. It was funny, like the first week I was there, it wasn't even a box of fruit and veg. It was, long, like corn on the cobs, the real ones picked out of a field. They were sitting in the box at the front door, and I thought it was a joke. It wasn't a joke.
No, that wasn't a language barrier issue, no.
No, that was it. Yeah, I didn't even know what to do with them at that stage. So that's where it started. Yeah, I came home and I was injured, and unfortunately, the injury went on that long. It nearly bankrupted my family trying to sort out the injury. Obviously, I wasn't granted or funded at that stage either. So I went to every specialist and tried to buy my way out of that injury as quickly as I possibly could. But I lost out on the contract of going back to that academy the year after and missed that entire season. Didn't think I was going to get going again at some time, at some point, but eventually I overcame that injury. But that was the first time where I really started to worry about what was coming next or what I was going to do, and the fact that I didn't have any other avenues or didn't start anything else at that stage.
Okay, so the niggle had kind of set in at that point in time. So is that kind of how you started thinking about your next career options, that first injury?
It was the first time I'd say I became aware of it.
Okay.
I didn't do anything about it, unfortunately. And to be honest, even though I might have brought the conversation up with some people, it just wasn't a conversation that fell on deaf ears largely. At the level that I was at, it was, you keep going the direction you're going, or you're not here, essentially. So for me at that point as well, there was no options that I was aware of to study online or any of that kind of stuff. So it was, I kind of pushed that itch away. And funnily enough, it overcame me anytime I was injured or sick, or I had forced layoffs or whatever. It was something that kind of started to kind of build inside. Yeah.
Sure. Did you find yourself then when you got going again that you're like, well, I'm fine again, so I'll just put that aside?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. In a nutshell, yeah. I'd win a race a few months later and that'd be it, I'd be gone again. That feeling would be gone away.
I think that's a normal thing to do. Be like, everything's fine. I don't need to worry. I've got
Absolutely.
this covered.
Got it covered, yeah.
Yeah. So what was the next step for you?
So after I overcame that injury again, that was an apparent setback, of failure, whatever way you want to look at it. Everyone was looking at, as a cyclist, you've kind of got up until you're under 23 to really make a name for yourself. The big pro teams very rarely pluck someone that's kind of come out of that age bracket, unless you're exceptional, or you do something exceptional. So I was very mindful of that, and I felt like there was a bit of a clock on me reaching that level. So that spurred me on, and I went back to France for a couple of months the following year. And within 6 months, I'd done that well in that stint that I got picked up by a pro team in the UK. Rafa Condor was the name of the team. Ironically, my previous mentor Paul, who had died in that car accident, it was a team that we both spoke about for years, about getting to. So I felt like it was, to be honest, when I started out in cycling, or when I kind of made the decision after he'd passed away to go pro, I felt like I'd achieved what I'd wanted to achieve when I landed there.
Yeah.
Initially, when I signed that contract, it was huge. I remember getting my first team kit. I hadn't even obviously landed over there yet, but they delivered everything to the house. The bikes and everything arrived, and it was a real justification for all the hard work, setbacks, and family obviously seeing the stuff being delivered. And that was huge. That was definitely a highlight. But then, like everything, the actual reality of being a professional cyclist kicked in very, very quickly. Ironically, the lifestyle at that level is not too much different than the amateur level, although you have a lot more done for you. In terms of you're flying 3/4 of the year, you're in airports most of the time, you're in hotels 3/4 of the year. So that was a bit of a change rather than being based in one place. But I'd go as far as saying that I was a little bit underwhelmed of what being a professional cyclist was like in that first year. And I think that was partly because I hadn't really got a goal past reaching professional ranks. I felt like, I'm here now, I've done what I wanted to do. And when that happened, it was that itch that I was telling you about, of what was coming next, became largely unbearable. At times when I was having setbacks, but that year in my first pro team was a year of setbacks like no other. And doctors and team managers that were around me had never seen bad luck. They quoted it like it. I cost the team an absolute fortune in broken equipment and stuff that year. I just went through broken bikes every week. I was coming in, and the bikes are worth 10 or 15 grand. So every time they see me coming in, he actually handed me a bill at the end of the year. And it was basically a tot up of the amount of equipment that I broke over the year, something like 100,000 worth of equipment. So he's like, your contract is pretty much null and void, So it was only a joke, funnily enough, but
I'd say you were grateful.
I was, yeah. But that year, if you had told me at the start of the year that I would have considered walking away from the sport, at the end of that year, I would have said no, not a chance. It's not going to happen. But like with all setbacks, I think you can get up from one, you get up from two, you start questioning things when you get up from the third. But if you keep going back and the same thing keeps happening again, there's an element of am I actually supposed to be here? Am I supposed to be doing this? So to give some context, the first accident I had was the first race that I competed at that level, at a pro level, that was televised. It was on Eurosport. It was in Australia, and my parents would have been up early watching the race at home. And the first day went well. The second day was a stage that suited me, and it was about 15-20K to go on the stage. And I can remember being in a long line, and there's wind coming from the left-hand side. So everyone is kind of huddled over to the right-hand side, trying to get up each other's side to get a bit of shelter from the wind. And we were going pretty fast, I'd say 50 kilometers an hour. And the person in front of me kind of flicked out of the way really quick, and I had no time to react. And I hit basically a makeshift building site, stack of bricks, cement mixer type thing at 50 kilometers an hour. And my last memory is basically flying through the air with my chin first. So landed on the ground, tore tendons off my elbows, destroyed myself pretty badly. And that was arguably the worst crash I'd ever had, definitely the worst one I've had up until that point. But I had 3 more like that in very quick succession. And I came back from every one of them, and it took a huge amount of mental resolve, especially, the guys on here will know there was so much preparation to build up to that race for it to be pulled away by something that was largely out of your control. So that was really difficult, but I got back up and I went again, and then the same thing happened again. Got back up, went again, same thing happened again, and that itch I was telling you about, like I said, it just became unbearable. And I started halfway through the season, unknowns to anybody else on the team, I started looking into university courses, coming back and doing the leave insert. And even though I was still competing at an international level, I kind of, looking back, decided that I was starting to look other directions.
Okay. And what were the first things that your mind went to in terms of university courses or education? What did you, at that point in time, feel like was your path?
I had a junior cert up until that point, so university was way down the track. And to be honest, for anybody that is in my position or has been in my position when I came back, jumping into doing a leaving cert, having not done it, if a conversation started in a room, about academics or about the leaving cert, I often found I was nervous or didn't want to speak about it, or I actually genuinely felt quite ashamed about the academic level that I'd gotten to or that I hadn't gotten to. So even if a university had opened up the door straight away without the leaving cert, I felt like it was something that I needed to do. It was something that I just needed to go back personally and kind of finish. And I did that, and it was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done. That was done in night courses in Navan, of all places. 9-10 o'clock in Navan, if anyone knows it, Jesus Christ, it was hideous, it was horrible. But I really had to bury the ego away. The classroom was full of people that, largely at that stage, I felt like I should have been ahead of in life. To be honest, I'd worked so hard, and these people, they were going out and breaks, smoking joints halfway through the classes, and I was scratching my head, going, "What the fuck am I doing here? Is this really where I've landed? Is this really where I've ended up?" But that was the reality of it. That's where I'd landed myself, and luckily enough, I had the ability to kind of put that away and say, "Look, this is how it is. You gotta suck it up and do it."
Yeah,
So,
this is a point I suppose I talk to a lot of players about. So can you set the scene for us a little bit there? You've come from the professional sport background. So what in your life, or what's in that's no longer available to you once you've come home? So you have, media, you have sponsorship, you have an income. What's the contrast between that and your dark nights in Navan?
Some contrast, yeah. So I'd lived away from home since I was 17. I now was 23, 24, back living in my mother and father's house. They had moved from Dunboyne, County Meath, down to Enfield, which I wasn't all that happy about, even though I wasn't.
How dare they move on without you?
Yeah, exactly. It didn't even have a bedroom in the house anymore. That's how long I was gone. So I came back home and I found myself living at home. And, obviously, if I flicked through everything, all of a sudden I was living at home, didn't have my own independence, didn't have a wage. As you said, my phone stopped ringing, coaches weren't ringing, physios weren't ringing. There was no roster being sent to me. There was no conversation at home about how the training day went. It had completely changed. But funnily enough, it had changed in a way. For me, it didn't change in a negative way. I kind of had this weird idea in my head that I'd made a move for the right reason and that this was a positive thing. The only negative that came from that transition part was my interpretation of how everybody else was dealing with my transition was very difficult. I mostly at home, funnily enough. That became quite difficult, especially because at that stage I hadn't figured out getting a job. I just wanted to get the leaving cert done. But I was 24, and my dad's eyes, you're like, you're 24, you need to earn.
So how did those conversations go in the house? How did you tell us maybe what was the conversation with your parents about coming home? Like, guys, you've moved house, you've got rid of my bedroom, but is the couch free?
Yeah. I came home at the end of that season, and I was pretty scuffed up from the crashes, and it was quite warm. I can remember sitting out in the back garden, and I can remember just bringing the conversation up. And like every athlete goes through this phase every year. It might be every couple of months they might get an idea, or start conversation starts that, fuck it, I can't be interested. I'm not doing this anymore. I don't want to train today, or I don't want to train for a week. I think every athlete that trains at a high level goes through that kind of thought process at some point. So they thought when I brought it up initially that it was he'd be fine in a couple of weeks. He's just gone through a phase. But I knew, funnily enough, I actually knew when I hit the ground the last time that I was done, and I tried to tell them forcefully, no, I'm actually not going back. And it kind of just slowly seeped its way in. They see me doing things that I'd never done before. All of a sudden, I was going out all of a sudden, and I'd never done anything like that before. It was completely unheard of. I kind of lived like a monk for the 5 years previous. So to be going out on the lash and coming home late to their house as a 24-year-old was probably a bit weird,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And how involved were your parents in your sporting career? So was there an adjustment for them then when you were no longer Aaron the cyclist?
There was an adjustment on the way in as well. So on the way into the sport, they thought that was just a phase as well. And I'm not buying him a $3,000 bike. He's just going to fucking pack it in a couple of months. It's not going to happen. So they slowly got into it, and particularly my dad. But then my dad became the biggest supporter ever. He followed me around the whole world. And, with cycling, you compete in every country, and they went everywhere. I went to the World Championships every year and followed me around the place. So when I came back home and that was gone, yeah, it was difficult because I had a very close relationship with my dad up until that point. I would have talked about training sessions every day and how things were going, and the pro races that would have been on the TV that I wasn't at. We'd have a discussion about that. So he felt uncomfortable bringing even up conversations about cycling, and we just completely stopped talking. And then the conflict started of me living ordinary life underneath his roof, essentially, trying to get my shit together. And yeah, conflict started for the first time ever at home, and it was difficult. Yeah,
You have siblings, don't you?
I do indeed. Yeah.
How did they feel about you being a pro cyclist? Did they care? They were like, oh, off he goes.
There was a little bit of off he goes, and I actually spoke to them last week. It was an interesting conversation. I knew this question was going to be asked, so I started quizzing at home to see how they actually took the transition 7 years later, once all the emotions have died down.
Well, you hope anyway.
Typical Irish dad, was like trying to draw blood from a stone with him, so we'll forget him. But my sisters truthfully felt like I was the spoiled one. I was the one that everybody spoke about. Every family dinner became about where Aaron was, what Aaron was doing with his life. So funnily enough, the conversation about me retiring, my sister's first reaction was, thank God he's finished. We don't have to listen to cycling anymore, So that was the reaction of my sisters. They would have been very young at that stage. But yeah, my parents initially found it very, very difficult. Yeah.
And how about now? What do you think? Do you feel like you were, I don't want to say spoiled, but were you spoiled?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Once I'd gotten to that level, shown promise and gotten to a professional level, I think every conversation and anybody that met my mother and father would have brought up it would have been in a, whether it was in a paper or they read something or whatever. And yeah, that must have been difficult for them. I think, looking back, I took his reaction to it very hard. I think when I put myself back into my shoes then, I couldn't understand why he thought going back to education was a bad idea. I just couldn't get my head around it. And it took a very long time. It took years and a bit of maturity to realize how difficult it was for them. The whole transition up until now for them was hard, way harder than it was for me. Obviously, I had my difficulties and ups and downs, but it was way more difficult for them. Still people asking, even relatives, distant relatives will go, how's the bike going with Aaron? Is he still racing away? And they're like, no, he retired 5 years ago, so it's gas.
I'm sure the Christmas dinner table is interesting anyway, because I'm sure you get asked your opinion of the current events. There was something you said there about the decision to go back to education not being a good one. And I think this is a very different, there's a huge range of opinions on this. And certainly I think the narrative that we push a little bit with professional athletes is that you need a degree. Now, I don't buy it, but I'm curious about your opinion. What was the education path you chose? Obviously, you talked about feeling like you needed to accomplish the Leaving Cert. Why did you pick that pathway? What led you there, or how did you make the decision to go to Navan and do it in night courses?
Largely, the Leaving Cert started with just that feeling of not being able to feel comfortable with the level that I'd gotten to academically at that stage. I don't know where that ever came from. Like my family, there's no history of great academics in my family, so I don't know where it came from. But I felt like I needed to do it for myself. But when I came out of there, I knew I wasn't built for building sites, to be honest. A lot of them were tradesmen, and I'd done enough summers at that to realize that, I have enough of a brain to realize that's not where I want to go consciously. And my dad didn't want me going there either. Not for any other reason other than it just wasn't me. It didn't suit me. And, the conversation started around going to college, and I still wasn't sure whether I was going to go at that point. There was no massive urge to go to college, but finally I felt like something good came from my years as a cyclist. Some doors started to, I wouldn't say open, but the conversations started that I was looking at going, and sports courses were obviously the obvious one to go to. So I just had a couple of conversations, and the conversations went really well, and it just kind of, I slipped into going to DCU, and that's how it started.
Who were the conversations with? Who were the sort of people that were able to open those doors?
Funnily enough, sport is very small in Ireland, and I think if you're, as it is, yeah, that it is. If you're anyway open to conversation and doing a bit of networking, and that's something I'll get onto a little bit later. It's something that came naturally to me, was reaching out to people and having conversations, regardless if those conversations go anywhere. And it's almost like dropping little breadcrumbs everywhere. A conversation leads to another conversation, and it goes somewhere, and someone says, I was talking to him before, and that's kind of where it went. And someone put me in touch with a guy called Giles that was running the course at the time in DCU, and you know him, Emma, and
I do.
he was a really nice guy, and told me the qualifications that I needed. And I was studying at that stage in the Leaving Cert in Navan. I was doing the only science subject I was doing was biology, so I had to lump in physics and chemistry with 3 months to go. So that was exciting, and yeah, that added to the turmoil. Yeah, no, not at all. It was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. But again, just out of generosity, I bumped into someone. I went out on the bike one day to meet a friend for a spin, and he had another friend there who happened to be, ironically enough, a physics and chemistry teacher, secondary school teacher.
Sure.
Loved cycling, knew the level I competed at, and was like, I'll homeschool you. And I said, look, I have no money to give you. He said, I don't want any money. I don't want any money at all. Just go for the occasional spin with me if you're over. So for people like that, I'm forever indebted to. Without him, I wouldn't have passed those exams, and I wouldn't have gone into DCU, ironically. So that was key.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's something that we see in the football network as well. The people are generous. They're willing to help out, and particularly have those sort of conversations that you're talking about. What are you interested in? Where are you going? Where do you think you might want to be in a few years' time? And particularly people who were involved in the sport, they love giving back. So
I find
how
that
did you?
Initially, though, when I came back, I almost felt like those people were going to reach out automatically. I thought that they were going to just start springing up and going, you were at this level, let's give you a job, or let's give you this course. And that really doesn't happen. And I think it's a really tough lesson to learn when you've, scaled the biggest mountains in the world and trained harder than everybody and gone through tremendous amounts of hardship, to come back to realize that nobody really gives a shit. Not very many people care. And it's a real kick in the nuts, pardon the pun, for the ego. And I took that hard initially, but I had to pack it away, and you just have to get on with it. And I started myself with help of nobody else. And to put into context, at this stage, family, they weren't on the university bandwagon at that stage at all. They were still going, he's going back, he'll go back on the bike next year, wait and you see. So I was doing all that networking myself, and cycling and whatever sport you're in, like you said, it tends to be full of good people, and I got helped by a certain few in particular, and the doors gradually opened. I would say they didn't fling open. I had to wiggle my way through, but I got there in the end.
Okay, so how old were you then when you started in DCU?
That was in 2014, so I would have been 25, 24, 25.
Okay, so you've had a career already. Your
Yeah.
family believe that you are going to return to that career.
Yeah.
So they're somewhat banking on you becoming a college dropout sometime soon.
Yeah,
And
probably.
you're in class now with a bunch of 18-year-olds. How's life going for you at that point?
Yeah, it was initially, it was really difficult. I won't lie, I was very, very, very lucky. Whether you put it down to luck or whatever, the crop of, they weren't even mature students. Everyone's students at some, a 40 or 50-year-old. They weren't. Some of them, actually, one of them works with the FAI now. Andy is his name. He's works as a performance analyst with you guys, I think. So he was one of them, and I had one other in particular who also had a past career. John was his name, and he was, 600 point leaving certer, had done incredibly well academically, and was a big shot in PwC for a couple of years, completely self-imploded, you won't mind me saying that, and decided to go back and do sports science out of nowhere. So he was there, and I was so used to competitive environment, and he was the perfect target to latch on to. He eased through with 80-90% the whole way through, but I just picked him and said, John, I'll take you on, kind of thing. And we kind of battled our way through, and stupid stuff, but it was the environment I was used to, and that got me through the first couple of years, and I sped on through to intra, where my next transition came, funnily enough.
Okay, so for those of you who probably or maybe don't know what it is, Intra is a program that DCU offers where they give you 6 months, 4 or 6 months, it depends on whether you want to get paid, in your third year to go out and get some work experience, so that you leave with your education, but also with a clue about what the real world is like, and something on your CV, effectively. So where did you go for your Intra, or what did you do for it?
So with college, unlike a lot of people that had been there, obviously came from either, John had saved a lot of money from his past career, but the rest of them had come straight from leaving certs, and they had grants and all sorts. I had to fund my own way through, and I got the odd few bob from home, but it was very tough at the start, because I decided to move out in first year of college as well. I had my first relationship at that stage, so I just went all in on new experiences. It was like new relationship, move out, go to college, and it was mental. That first year was nuts, and I had to find some way of earning money, and the lowest hanging fruit for me was coaching at that stage. So a friend of mine, I'd actually raced with him previously, had started a coaching company, and I got involved in that, and the coaching company got bigger and bigger. So I jumped into that for my placements while in DCU, and while there, it kind of grew to a stage where there was another opportunity kind of sitting on the outside of it, which was a marketing company. I was no marketer, had no experience in marketing, but the guy that was funding it, we happened to get on very well. He thought I had the skill set to drive the business on, and I ended up fronting a social media marketing business for the next year and a half, 2 years, and didn't go back to college until last year. I went back and finished it. So yeah, that was a whirlwind and a half.
It sounds like it. The person who pinpointed you for the social media and marketing, what characteristics did they see in you that,
He was
led to that job?
I kind of have a couple wrote down here. He was like the third kind of mentor on the path to where I am now. And even though it was quite brief in terms of what I learned from him, but I learned a lot of lessons from him. He's obviously incredibly successful in terms of investments and entrepreneur and this, that, and the other. But aside from that, I remember the first thing after seeing me working for a while, he started to relate the two of us to being very similar to each other. And then I kind of bought into that. And then I started looking at this guy that was incredibly successful on the outside, had, you know, the house, the big house, the family, the big car, the flashy everything, and had everything together, had a couple of businesses, and, you know, was a multimillionaire. And I was like, you know, that's most people's conceptual idea of what success looks like. You know, it was, that's what it looked like to me. And until I buried myself into that lifestyle for a year and a half and realized that I was actually, you know, on someone else's journey and doing something for somebody else. Is nothing to do with what I wanted to do at all. I think it was my drive, my motivation to prove something, to show that I could do something like that, that attracted him to me initially. And yeah, my work ethic, I wouldn't stop where other people would, I think. So that's why we kind of gelled together at that stage. But once the small little cracks started to appear that I wanted to do something else, or I might want to branch out of this business, that relationship started to kind of get a bit turbulent.
Okay, so I guess there's kind of a pattern there of you've had mentors through your career and been comfortable having conversations about what it is that you want, and then opportunities come thereafter.
Yeah.
But also I think at the start of the conversation you said that you enjoyed cycling because you're a loner, because you like being alone. Then suddenly you're fronting up this social media and marketing company. How do those two things marry?
Yeah, not very well. You know, in terms of everything that I do, and anybody that knows me close enough knows that I'm, you know, I like to do some extroverted stuff, but I like being on my own. I like, you know, I like spending time on my own and going away and preparing and doing stuff on my own. So a social media business to someone that really dislikes everything that social media is about was a really ironic place for me to land up. Or end up. So, you know, it was running advertising campaigns that, you know, for beer brands, and, you know, it was just really weird. And I was so busy that I didn't really give myself time to take in the work that I was doing. And I took a break at the back end of the second year, and it was the first break that I've taken. I don't know how my partner stayed with me through all of this. I'd met my my wife to be at that stage. She deserves accolades for what she went through during that process. But we went away, and before I went, I kind of had an idea that I was gonna stop, but I actually took a lot of time to think about it when I was away, elongated the holidays a small bit, and came back and left straight away. That was it.
Okay. I think there's another career path that you explored, isn't there?
Yeah, I tried to jump over that one there, Emma.
No, I don't think we will. I think we'll dive into that one too.
So when I came back initially from it's very funny because it's funny what the media latch on to. I was explaining this to yourself already, Emma. But so when I came back, a friend of mine runs an agency in Dublin, largely acting, some modelling, and all sorts of stuff like that. And again, kind of synonymous with the social media company. And probably everybody looking at me go, "Don't tell me he was a model. Look at the head of him." It was kind of exactly that. But he ran this company and said, "Look, I can get you some work." And I was at that stage where it was never something that I wanted to do for a career, but I needed to figure out the boundaries. To put into context, I'd never really gone to nightclubs, gone out on the social scene, done any of that sort of stuff. So I was kind of figuring those things out in my mid-20s. So doing that, becoming a model, let's say, I landed myself in the weirdest places. And the most awkward, uncomfortable positions for someone like me. Coming from living in a dorm on my own in France to standing in a room with 20 or 30 people with no clothes on, you know, it was incredible. And yeah, it was uncomfortable. It wasn't what I wanted to do, but I enjoyed it, and I got very well paid initially for it, which was great. But the media got a sniff of it, funnily enough, and all of a sudden, you know, former pro cyclist, model, and even the cycling websites got onto it, and you can imagine the level of slagging that went on at that stage.
Well, there's just so many puns available.
Yeah, it was incredible. So yeah, I done it, and I look back, and, you know, in some ways I find it very hard to even talk about it, but I learned a lot of valuable lessons from it, funnily enough. Exactly what I didn't want to be, or where I didn't want to end up.
So do you think then there's value in trying things just to see?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, you know, for me, and that's why I hope anybody that's listening to the talk, that I learned a lot of made so many mistakes and still make them. And luckily enough, one of the mentors, one of the biggest things that he taught me was self-development and reading and stuff. And I'm always and always have been an avid reader. But for me, it's learning the mistakes through other people's mistakes, if you possibly can do that as much as possible. And I know it sounds a bit, you know, airy fairy, but you know, if you're around the right people and they give you the right advice, it's just trying not to make all the same mistakes that they did. um, and I hope to think that I'm finally getting to that stage where I'm not making the same mistakes, or I'm not making mistakes all the time. I'm actually doing stuff for the right reasons. um, so yeah.
Yeah. Folks, we'll be wrapping up in about 10-12 minutes. So if you have any questions for Aaron, please feel free to pop them over to me or to Ollie, and I'll put them to you. Aaron, why don't you tell us where you're at now? Because I think you've found something that you're really passionate about now.
Yeah, ironically, it's something that I do best. It's transition. I've transitioned from, you know, one thing into another for so many years, and I like to think I handled a lot of them quite well. Learned a lot along the way, and you know, I enjoyed coaching, and coaching gave me a lot of. I got a lot of satisfaction from coaching, but just felt like that I wanted to branch into areas that I wasn't yet qualified really to go into. So I'm doing a master's at the moment in sports psychology, and yeah, I look to for my ideal first role will be working with athletes in the context of transition.